Okay, so you guys have sent in some really interesting stuff about international students in Canada this time around. We've got a government report here, a couple of opinion pieces, and even a recent news article that looks like it might contradict some of the other stuff. But yeah, we're going to be diving into their economic impact, especially with all this stuff going on with tariffs from the US.
Yeah, it's a pretty hot topic right now for sure.
So, our mission for this deep dive is to try and understand how much of an impact international students have on the Canadian economy and whether these recent changes to the policy are good or bad in the long run. So, why don't we just start with the money? The sheer amount of money these students are bringing into Canada is honestly mind blowing. The government report we have here states that in 2022, it was a whopping $37.3 billion. dollars.
Wow. Yeah, that's not just a small amount either. I mean, to put that in perspective, that's almost 5% of all the goods that Canada exports every year. It's almost like Canada is exporting education itself as a product.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's not just about the tuition fees either. All that money gets spent on rent, groceries, transportation, entertainment, all sorts of things. The report actually says that it translates to an extra $30.9 billion dollars added to the Canadian GDP and over 361,000 jobs. That's 1.2% their entire economy.
It's a huge shift from the traditional way we think about trade. Instead of just exporting things like lumber or oil, Canada is exporting knowledge and skills.
Hmm.
With all these new tariffs on Canadian goods coming from the U.S., it seems like relying on international students could be a really smart move.
Right, and that's what some of these opinion pieces are arguing as well, that international students are like a safety net for the Canadian economy in a way. But the interesting thing is that if you look closely, it seems like Ontario is the one that's really benefiting the most from all of this. Over half of that GDP impact and almost 200,000 of those jobs are all in Ontario.
Hmm. It's interesting. It does raise an important question, though. What if something happens and the number of international students coming to Canada starts to change? Could Ontario actually be hurt by this because they're relying so heavily on these students? It seems like there's a bit of a balancing act going on here.
Yeah, you're right. And this new news article we have actually throws a bit of a curveball into the mix. It looks like Canada's actually starting to cut back on international student visas.
Hmm.
They're expecting a 45% drop in new study permits for 2024.
Wow, 45%. That's a lot more than I thought. Didn't the government only plan to cut back a little bit?
Yeah, it seems like it was a lot more than they were expecting. Apparently, they were trying to focus on cracking down on these shady colleges that are just handing out diplomas to anyone, like those diploma mill places. But it looks like the impact has been felt way more broadly than that. Even legitimate universities are starting to worry. So, is Canada shooting itself in the foot here? Did they go too far trying to fix the system and now they're going to end up hurting their economy?
It's definitely a valid concern. I mean, the article actually quotes some experts who believe that the old system definitely needed some work, but they're saying that the government might have gone overboard with these changes.
Yeah, I can see that. So, what kind of consequences are we talking about here?
Well, for one thing, a lot of colleges are being hit hard by this. Some of them are even having to shut down entire programs or lay off staff.
Ouch. So it's not just the students who are being affected by this.
Exactly. And it's not just colleges either. Even master's and PhD students who are supposed to be exempt from these new caps are starting to see a decline in their numbers as well.
Huh. Why is that?
Well, it's possible that all this negative attention surrounding these changes is actually discouraging some students from choosing Canada.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
And if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture here, it's important to remember that Canada actually needs to attract talented people from all over the world if they want to stay competitive. But at the same time, they also need to make sure that they're managing things sustainably. It's a tricky balance.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. Okay, so we've talked about the billions of dollars that international students are bringing into Canada. But before we jump to any conclusions, we should probably take a look at the other side of the coin. What about the costs associated with all of this? What about the costs associated with all of this?
Well, it's important to remember that, like any complex issue, there are always going to be two sides to this coin. We've talked about the economic benefits, but we also need to consider the costs involved.
Right, and our sources do mention some challenges. Like this news article talks about how the influx of international students is putting a lot of strain on affordable housing in cities like Toronto and Vancouver. Those are some of the most popular places for these students to go.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's a pretty common problem in a lot of countries that host a large number of international students. When you have so many people moving to one place, the demand for housing goes up, and that can drive prices up. And then it becomes harder for everyone to find a place they can afford to live.
Yeah, it's a ripple effect. And it's not just housing either. The article also brings up concerns about healthcare and social services. Are those systems even equipped to handle this many new people coming in?
That's a really good point. I mean, if a country is going to welcome a large number of international students, they need to make sure that they have the infrastructure and services in place to support them. And not just the students themselves, but the domestic population as well.
Exactly. It's all about balance. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of brain drain, the idea that all these talented people are leaving their home countries to come to Canada for better opportunities. Our sources don't really go into too much detail about this, but it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, it's a really complex issue with no easy answers. I mean, on the one hand, international exchange and collaboration is a good thing. But it's also important to think about how we can create environments that encourage people to stay in their home countries and contribute there.
Right. It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle with a bunch of missing pieces. So while there are definitely some clear economic benefits to having all these international students coming to Canada, we can't just ignore the potential downsides. It's a balancing act for sure. Okay, so we've talked about the money, but let's move beyond just the purely economic aspects for a minute. What about the social and cultural impact of all these students coming to Canada?
That's a really important aspect that often gets overlooked. These students bring so much diversity and so many different cultural perspectives with them. It really enriches the social fabric of Canada and helps to foster cross-cultural understanding.
Yeah, and the opinion pieces we have actually talk about how this diversity in the student body is a good thing for everyone. It helps to better prepare graduates for a globalized world. They say that employers really value this kind of intercultural competence.
And it goes beyond just the classroom, too. A lot of these students get involved in their communities. They volunteer, they participate in cultural events, they really contribute to the vibrancy of their local communities.
Yeah, it's a two-way street. The students get to experience living and studying in a new country, and Canada gets to benefit from their unique perspectives and talents. It sounds like a win-win situation. But are there any potential downsides to this kind of cultural exchange?
Well, one challenge is making sure that these students are able to successfully integrate into their new communities. It's really important to create welcoming environments where they feel supported and have opportunities to connect with other people, both domestic and international students.
Yeah, because the news article did mention that some students struggle with loneliness and isolation, especially in those first few months after they arrive. It can be really tough to adapt to a new culture and environment.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to provide these students with the support and resources they need to adjust and thrive. Universities, colleges, local communities, they all have a role to play in creating that sense of belonging.
It sounds like attracting international students is only half the battle. The other half is making sure that they have what they need to succeed once they're here. This deep dive has really been eye-opening. It's shown me just how complex this issue really is. There's the economic impact, the social and cultural integration, and everything in between.
Yeah, it's a really dynamic and evolving landscape.
Yeah.
And by exploring all these different perspectives, it becomes clear that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And it's not just a Canadian issue either. International education is a global phenomenon.
Oh, that's a really good point. We've been focusing on Canada this whole time, but these challenges and opportunities are relevant to countries all over the world. It makes you wonder how other countries are approaching these same issues. What can we learn from each other?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of potential for countries to share best practices and learn from each other's experiences. It could help to create a more equitable and beneficial system for everyone involved.
Before we move on, was there anything else in the sources that really stood out to you?
Yeah, actually, one thing that caught my eye was how the news article emphasized the impact of international students in specific fields. Like masters and PhD students are really important for research and innovation, especially in fields like technology, engineering, and healthcare.
Right. Those are all fields where Canada has a really strong global reputation and where the demand for talent is super high.
Exactly. So losing those highly skilled individuals could actually have a negative impact on Canada's competitiveness.
So it sounds like the government is trying to walk a really fine line here.
Yeah, they want to crack down on these diploma mills, but they also need to make sure that they're still attracting and retaining top talent in these crucial fields.
It's all about finding that balance.
And then the article also brought up another interesting point, the role that international students could play in addressing Canada's aging population and labor shortages.
Oh, yeah, that's a big issue in a lot of developed countries right now.
Exactly. Canada's population is getting older and the birth rate is declining. So that's creating some gaps in the workforce that international students could potentially help to fill.
Right. They can bring in new skills and fresh perspectives, and they also contribute to the economy through their spending and taxes.
It's a potential win-win situation.
Hmm.
But it also highlights the importance of creating clear pathways to permanent residency and citizenship for those students who want to make Canada their home.
This deep dive has honestly been so insightful. It's really broadened my understanding of international education. It's not just about economics, it's about people, cultures, and the future of our societies.
I love that. It's about building bridges, connecting communities, and fostering a more inclusive and interconnected world.
We've covered so much ground today, and I know our listeners have a lot to think about. But before we wrap up, I'd like to leave you with a final thought-provoking question. What would you think about creating a global framework for international education? Something that addresses these challenges and opportunities in a more coordinated and equitable way.
That's a really interesting idea. It would definitely be a complex undertaking. But the potential benefits are huge. It could help to ensure that international education is a force for good, promoting global understanding and sustainable development.
Lots to think about for sure. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this deep dive into international students in Canada. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those deep dives coming. So it seems like Canada's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place with this whole international student thing. They've got this amazing opportunity, but they also need to figure out how to manage it all responsibly and fairly.
Yeah, it's a real tightrope walk.
Yeah.
Trying to keep that balance between the economic benefits and the pressures that come with it, like the housing situation, the strain on social services, and the whole brain drain thing. It's not an easy problem to solve.
Yeah, and reading this news article really made me realize how political this whole debate has become. There are some pretty strong opinions out there about what Canada's policy on international students should actually look like.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot button issue. You've got the economic arguments, but then you've also got concerns about immigration levels and national identity all mixed in there. It's interesting to see how these big global trends actually play out at a national level.
It's crazy. Some politicians want to put stricter limits on international students, but then others are saying that Canada actually needs to be more welcoming if they want to compete for global talent, especially when you consider how much money these students are bringing into the country.
It makes you wonder what the long-term consequences of all of this are going to be. Will these new policies make it harder for Canada to attract the best and brightest students from around the world? I guess only time will tell.
So we've talked about the economic side of things, the social and cultural impacts, and even the politics. If you had to pick one thing, what would you say is the most important takeaway from all of this?
Hmm, that's a tough one. But I think for me, it's the realization that there are no simple answers when it comes to international education. It's all about finding that balance and constantly evaluating and refining the approach. It's not just about coming up with a solution and calling it a day. It's an ongoing process.
That's a really good point. And this isn't just a conversation that needs to be happening in Canada either.
Exactly. This is a global issue.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. Hopefully this deep dive has sparked their curiosity to learn even more about this topic.
It's definitely been a fascinating discussion.
It has. All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into international students in Canada. Keep those curious minds engaged, and we'll see you next time. Please let me know if you have any other text you would like me to rewrite in a natural TTS style.